Sometimes a moment, a few minutes, if not seconds, is enough for an entire year to end up being inextricably linked to a particular name. And then there are men who go further and are not satisfied with a single heroic feat. They steal that page of the history of cycling for themselves. These are men like Fausto Coppi and Gino Bartali, capable of defining an era and of amazing an entire country. To this day, their names evoke powerful emotions, both for those who were there, rooting for one or the other, but also for those who were born after. But they're able to do that also thanks to days like those that the two experienced in the spring of 1952. While over the years, the Giro has always managed to tell something about the era in which it takes place, Coppi and Bartali, the champion and giroditalia, became its emblem, an undisputed symbol of their time. The mountain has a simple rule. If you want to go further, you can't go around it. You have to get to the top. This is in Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs. Produced by Dogge in association with Agenzia ICE for an appreciation of the best that Made in Italy has to offer. Episode 5, Colle del Gran San Bernardo, the golden age of Coppi and Bartali. There's a name behind the post-war Giro, but we could also say behind the Giro more generally, as we know it today. It is that of Vincenzo Torriani, the man who wanted it, built it, and imagined it stage by stage, year after year. He was from Lombardy, born and raised in a family of workers and entrepreneurs, as often was the case in Italy at the beginning of the last century. His grandparents ran a hotel, his parents an oil mill, and he'd spent the most difficult years of the war in Switzerland, to avoid submitting to the violence that would have broken him, such as the call to arms after the armistice. Once back in a pacified Milan, he immediately showed his Lombard nature by getting busy as an organizer of events. He did so with charisma and vision. He understood the enormous power of sport, capable of uniting, creating social cohesion, involving Italians exhausted by the conflict in something positive. What cycling could give was precious in the post-war period when the country was still bruised and divided, but with a deep desire for normality. Vincenzo Torriani was the man behind the 29th edition, the one that began in June 1946. Passing through a nation still marked by war. It is him, a young Torriani, who travelled the country on behalf of a more mature Armando Colle, personally verifying possible roads and routes. And here is the first demonstration of how the Corsa Rosa is absolutely influenced by its time. In 1946, the start had to be postponed by a month, so as not to interfere with a date with history for the Italians. Indeed, on June 2nd, people entered the polling stations to vote. The result of the referendum decided the fate of Italy, which would end up leaving the monarchy behind to become a republic. Despite the destruction, the economic hardships, and all the difficulties, Torriani made it work and got cyclists on the saddle in 1946. On roads that were no longer paved, roads that had been bombed, among the rubble, and even afterwards. At the time, the Giro was Italy. It raced between cities carefully chosen for their symbolic value. And Italy wanted to be the Giro. Its protagonists, those men on bicycles who raced through the boot, performing feats, soon became symbols. Among them, 2 runners immediately stood out. The first was called Bartali, the second, Coppi. And they rode on bikes which were also the essence of the Italian spirit, Bianchi and Legnano. All the pieces were in place to ignite enthusiasm. 2 exceptional athletes, rivals on the road, who challenged each other in a long competition that fans from every region could witness in person, standing on the side of the road, 1 step away from the race. The vintage black and white photos show us small groups of people waiting for them to pass. Men, but also women and children, entire families. Cycling touches everyone. And then the press did the rest, narrating their deeds and creating the legend with unforgettable lines like, "There's one man alone in the lead. His shirt is white and blue. His name is Fausto Coppi," pronounced on the radio during the Cuneo Pinerolo match of '49 by the Piedmontese radio commentator Mario Ferretti. The reporters told the story of the 2 competing athletes, but they also outlined their human side in small pieces that at the end of the day were rushed to the editorial office after having been typed on typewriters. Even the press became a cog in that complex machine. Then cycling broke out of specialized magazines. Authors such as Dino Buzzati and Gianni Rodari wrote about it. And even then, the cinema was seduced by it. In 1948, the movie Totò at the Giro d'Italia came out. They used to sing Fausto and Gino, beauties on a bicycle, kisses and bicycles. Souvenir postcards were printed and stickers were collected. It wasn't just sports anymore. It had entered popular culture as a whole. And to liven up the chronicles, radio commentaries and commentary, there were above all those 2, Coppi and Bartali. There was something very modern about the popularity they gained, something which was unusual at the time. Gino and Fausto became public figures who people in the streets talked about. Reporters began to follow their private affairs, and Coppi's love life was spoken of widely. The famous white lady with whom he fell in love caused much concern, as if it were a national affair. The fans took sides, the green lizards of Legnano and the blue eagles of Bianchi, with tense moments such as the arrival of the athletes at Vigorelli in 1947, amid the booing of their respective fans. The 2 cyclists were not just runners. They represented something bigger. Bartali was perceived to be a man of tradition, an old-fashioned cyclist with an open, exuberant character and his Tuscan straightforwardness. He followed his heart and instinct. On the other hand, Coppi was individualist, rational, lucid, and capable of meticulously preparing for each match. Even in that, he was very modern. He studied every aspect of the competition, from the mechanical details to the physical preparation to the correct nutrition. It was a battle of the traditional Italy and an Italy of the future. To understand how popular Coppi and Bartali were, here's an anecdote. On July 14th, 1948, an attack hit the secretary of the Communist Party Togliatti, and in the following hours, a dangerous tension grew in an already divided Italy. Legend has it that the Prime Minister, De Gasperi, called Bartali in France to ask him for a sporting event capable of reuniting the country, mending the political wound that the attack had opened. The next day, on the Isoard, Bartali gave the Italians a good reason to celebrate. United, concluding the tour as a protagonist. He, who some journalists painted just a few months before as in a moment of career crisis. It's impossible to say whether that phone call really took place or not, but it is interesting nonetheless that the set of events itself is at least plausible. Bartali and Coppi race. So does Italy. which emerges from the post-war period and enters a period dubbed the economic boom. Come 1952 and the 35th edition of the Giro, 20 stages for a total of 3,964 kilometers. Bartali is 5 years older than his rival, the class of 14 against the class of 1919. 38 years old, which in cycling is quite a lot. He won a lot before the war. Then for 5 years he measured himself against a completely different kind of challenge, transporting secret documents useful for saving the lives of hundreds of Jews on his bicycle. Then he returned to the track in an exciting challenge with his rival. In 1952, he'd reached the last years of his career, but his desire to race was still there. Fausto Coppi had a 5-year advantage over his historic rival, but he'd recently got through a not very bright period, marred by accidents, injuries, and heavy personal mourning. The previous season had ended due to an accident. Inadvertently bumped by Peverelli, he ended up on the ground with a serious fracture of the pelvis. It was a diagnosis that stopped him until autumn, the season in which he returned to the road for the Giro di Lombardia and then the Baracchi Trophy. On the Milan-Turin route in March 1951, he had another accident. This time he broke his collarbone, yet another problem that marked the career of the great cyclist. In any case, he took on the Giro, also giving us very important episodes such as the ascent of Cortina d'Ampezzo. But while you can recover from a fracture, there are other accidents that leave a mark that won't go away. In 1951, an already complicated year for Serse Coppi, brother of the champion of his wingman, ended up with a wheel on the rail and fell, hitting his head a few kilometers from the finish line of the Tour of Piedmont that he was running. He got up, got back on the saddle and finished the race. But that same night, in a hotel, he felt unwell. A few hours later, he died. A case of cerebral hemorrhage which was fatal to him. It's a tragedy that hits you indelibly. Fausto Coppi continued to run, to pedal. But something was off. In France, in the Pyrenees, he finished 33 minutes and 33 seconds behind the winner Colle. An incredibly bad result for a man like Fausto Coppi, who for an entire career had been known for other kinds of surprises. Then he recovered, it's true, but someone started to wonder if his season was over, or at least in decline. But he didn't get off his bike. The following year, here we are in 1952. When the Giro starts again, he was there. The champion and Ginetaccio showed the world that the era of Coppi and Bartali was not over. Not yet. The stage in the Dolomites was Coppi's, where he made it clear that he was aiming for an important result. On the Venice-Bolzano route, between the Falzarego at Pordoi and Sellava passes, he sprinted onwards, finding himself several minutes ahead of the others. And then, Gran San Bernardo. In that particular year, Coppi didn't cross it first. Bartali did. Thus showing the Italians a new chapter of the old story of the two champions who made cycling great. Then the Giro was decidedly owned by the champion, with an arrival in Milan that cleared any doubts from the heads of skeptics about its presumed end. More than 9 minutes ahead of Magni, the other great racer of the time. Then, as if that weren't enough, Coppi headed for France and answered the challenge, winning both the Giro and the Tour in the same year. And it's there that the two-wheeled heroes were immortalized in an image that's gone down in history. It was July 6th, 1952, about a month after the Gran San Bernardo. They were in the Transalpine Alps and pedaled towards the Col du Galibier, the photographer who was following the tour snapped an image that made history. Coppi was ahead, his eyes fixed on the road, a deep fatigue printed on both faces, and Bartali was just behind. However, their hands met in a gesture of passing a bottle of water. Rivals, enemies, but always together. Inextricably linked by that common road to the finish line. It'll never be known who was passing the bottle to who. Both felt that it was a useless clarification, elusively answering questions about it. Many equally irrelevant things have been told about that photo. That it happened other times, that it wasn't a completely spontaneous gesture. It doesn't really matter. It remains the best shot to tell the story of those two men, Coppi and Bartali, and perhaps also the country that chose them as heroes. Divided into two rival sides, yet still able to reach out in the name of solidarity, stronger than any divergence. Reflecting Italy's political landscape of the time, Coppi and Bartali ran as rivals. But Fausto would not have been the same without Gino, and vice versa. In that 1952, with the two champions still competing together and Coppi's victory, it seems to want to be confirmed that yes, Italy did it. Overcoming problems and divisions. And it did so by showing its character in the toughest stages, on the climbs of the Dolomites and of the Gran San Bernardo crossed by giroditalia. 2023 would sport the champion's name in its title. Suddenly, on January 2nd, 1960, the champion dies. He'd been traveling to a distant place, in what is now Burkina Faso, and returning to Italy, he'd begun to suffer from a fever that worsened despite treatment. A yet undiagnosed case of malaria took the champion away. The national press gave great prominence to the news, and front pages of all the newspapers showed his name. Tens of thousands of Italians attended the funeral. His contribution to the world of cycling is so powerful that 5 years later, it was decided to dedicate the highest peak of each edition of the Giro to him. In 2023, it is precisely the turn of Gran San Bernardo. It had been climbed 8 times in the history of the Giro, becoming yet more proof in 1957 of how the competition is in tune with the present. At the 40th edition of the Corsa Rosa, Gran San Bernardo became the terrain for the attack of the Belgian Charles Gaul on his opponents, on the dirt road between drifts of snow. An attack that failed because Bobet still managed to win the stage. But the summit patiently beckoned the angel of the mountain, who'd proven to be strong, especially in the cold. 2 years later, in the 1959 Giro, men of the caliber of Van Looy, Baldini and Anquetil raced in the Giro, and it's the latter who fought on the steepest stages. On Gran San Bernardo, Anquetil kept up with Gaul and seemed to be able to make it. The weather was inclement, and the two attacked each other. They both seemed to have what it took to aim for the shirt, but it was just an illusion of cycling, because then Anquetil collapsed. On Piccolo San Bernardo, he slowed down. His legs seemed to have given up. The descent that followed was even worse, with multiple punctures forcing him to stop. And Gaul went on, got to the end with an overwhelming lead. At the end of the 1950s, Piccolo and Gran San Bernardo bore witness to the challenge, not of the very Italian Coppi and Bartali, but of the man from Luxembourg and the Frenchman. It was a different time, another historical era that Torriani and his Giro understood and interpreted well. It was the dream of a Giro d'Europa. While politicians were taking the first steps to design the Union of Nations we know today, the project of a great event that would help offer the entire continent the opportunity to come together, just like the Giro had offered Italy. And while big plans were in the works, the French and Luxembourg champions arrived in the Bel Paese to put their mark on the Italian peaks. The public got used to those different names and began to become aware of what lay beyond the borders. And it did so just like this, seeing the Angel of the Mountain and Louison Bobet challenge each other on San Bernardo. The Giro was also this. Over the years, the Corsa Rosa has continued in many different ways to tell the story of Italy through which it ran, and sometimes even of the world around it. Sometimes it did so with small details, maybe with parts of the private story of those who raced it and won. Like in 1996, when the winner was Alexandra Gonchenkov, a Ukrainian with Russian citizenship. Athletes, stories, nationalities, in which you can find clues of the world that has been and will be. After all, this is the Giro, the race that always runs ahead. Or, taking up Cogne's definition, someone who certainly understood the tour well. A grand sports drama taking place in the most beautiful theatre in the world. And there's no risk in being mistaken in saying that Gino Bartali and Fausto Coppi were among the great protagonists in that incredible show. In Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs, is a Giro d'Italia podcast produced by Dogge, starring Daniel Tanner, executive producer Marta Donà and Carlo Lenotti. Written by Valentina Camarini, with the editorial support of Giacomo Botto. Directed by Marco Ferrarini. Producer Irene Oriani. Sound design and original music by Pasquale Lo Savio. Recording Dario Cuomo. Artwork Andrea Lodetti. English adaptation Diego Ferrarini. Special thanks to Silvia Forestieri, Eva Visentin and Simone Pozzi.
Una produzione Doggear.